Okay, so today we're going to be doing a presentation on an in-flight emergency simulation. So, as any pilot would like to have, that would be positive expectations for every flight. That all starts with a good pre-flight checklist, making sure that the aircraft is sound, avionics are sound, essentially all systems are functioning as intended. Now, prior to making it to that point, we're going to be checking the weather, making sure that the weather is good, and we're not going to be putting ourselves in an unsafe situation or scenario that isn't absolutely necessary. I personally fly in a Delta airspace, so we're going to use my specific airspace in this demonstration. So whenever you're coming back in, you have to have two-way radio contact with the Delta tower, and we're going to be coming back in. We have that contact made, kind of brings a sigh of relief, and I have ADS-B in, so I'm able to see that the traffic in this scenario is low. Always nice to see that when the pattern is not busy. Our current position, we're 7 miles from the field, flying at 2,500 feet, descending for pattern altitude of 1,100 feet. And once we kind of get to that point, it's very easy for most pilots in this scenario to become very comfortable. And when we get comfortable, sometimes we get lazy, we can overlook things. It can become a situational hazard if we get a little too confident, a little too comfortable with the way things are going. So we're coming back in, and all of a sudden we hear a loud noise. And of course, most pilots, including myself, have probably the number one fear in mind of being an engine loss, power loss mid-flight. It can bring an overwhelming amount of emotions that could easily take a bad situation and make worse. Now, when these things happen, or any emergency for that, we must stay calm. When we stay calm, we can make good, timely, and effective decisions. But if we do lose our composure, we are humans. You want to get a grip. You don't want to take forever doing it. You want to get yourself back to a baseline where you can function as a pilot that's able to be, once again, effective and efficient. Now, ABCs are a great way to initially start any emergency. Um, Attitude for best glide speed. We're going to go over these in more depth in the next couple slides. Best field selected, cockpit checks performed. That was a part of this King School private pilot course. Muscle memory makes for best decision making, meaning that whenever we get into an emergency, we don't have to go into reading a checklist to initially get started. We're able to make some decisions promptly for the sake of time and make them safely. Most importantly, efficiency leads to effectiveness, and when we can do that, we can be a more competent pilot. We can be a more safe pilot to address any situation we might encounter. But in the event of any situation that is not planned, we must fly the aircraft first. Nothing else is more important than maintaining that positive control of the aircraft. Now, A stands for airspeed or attitude. Depends on who you talk to. You might get a different answer. Accomplishing the proper attitude to get to our airspeed, or accomplishing our airspeed, once again, however you want to say it. Our VG, our best glide speed, is monumental. It's going to get us the most distance and buy us the most time to make decisions. Now, every plane has a glide ratio. It's essentially just the altitude that a plane is going to lose versus the distance that it will travel in the time spent doing so. So my Cessna 172, it can go roughly about a mile and a half per 1,000 feet lost. Now, basic calculations would tell you that if the field was 7 miles away and I'm at 2,500 feet, 2.5 times 1.5 is not 7. We're not making it to the field. And as stated in the PHAC, this is always great to know. Just that, once again, reiterating the glide ratio so that you can know how far you're at any given time an emergency strikes by reference to your altimeter. B stands for best landing site. Now, we've already established that we're not making the runway, even though it's the most ideal spot. But we can't take forever looking for a different spot if we know we're not going to make the field, make the field of the airport. Now, fields and roads are to be considered if the airport can't be assured, but in the event that we can't have the runway, we got to use some common sense, and sometimes it's not so common. Seeing a brown field might and be very inviting that it's going to be a good place to land, only to find out it might be this. So we have to use our eyes. We have to use just basic thinking of, hey, if we're looking at the ground, try to see if it's wet, try to see if it's low crops, if the field is well kept, to make sure that when we do land, we can land safely, we can land smoothly, that we're not going to hit anything that could hurt us, make the situation worse, or potentially hurt others. Now, if we have roads nearby, we can consider those, but roads can yield many hazards, things like power lines, potholes, structures, cars, you name it. There's a lot that we can't account for. Sometimes these aren't the best places. I like to look for fields, especially if you can find a farm or something. Might be the best place to go. Where I fly is a very rural area, so finding fields usually isn't very hard. And then C, once we've got that airspeed or that attitude set, we've got our landing site we're scanned for. We have one picked out and maybe two that we've considered. We can go down the checklist in the direction flying of our landing site that we're trying to pick to potentially try to troubleshoot this in-flight issue. Now, emergencies are not the time to learn the checklist. We should have done that prior to getting into the plane. We need to know how to address any scenario that might come up before we ever get into that scenario. And the PHAC clearly even states that memorizing the immediate actions is the best way to be prepared. Now, keeping that checklist nearby, anytime I'm flying, I keep the checklist within arm's length reach. I don't ever want to get into a scenario and be like, oh my goodness, I need my checklist and I can't find it. That's time spent and that's time that we can't get back. And right now, time is our number one commodity and we must use it wisely. Now, one thing about the checklist is that there might be situations where we will use different portions in sequence. So, for example, had this have been a fire in flight, I would use the fire in flight checklist portion first, which means I'm going to shut off the engine. Now I'm going to slide back up here to the power loss in flight area so I can get the engine running. If that doesn't go smoothly, well, I'm going to slide one box down to the next portion. And we might have to do that various scenarios. So don't ever think that you might only need one. Now, we also want to find the specific portion for our issue. And like we stated on the previous slide, you should know on your checklist where each various portion is located. So that way, whenever it comes up, that we can quickly jump to that area and not waste any time saying, oh, well, let me see. Do I need this? Do I need that? I can just go say, hey, I've lost power in flight. This is where I need to start to hopefully troubleshoot the issue. Now, I fly in Florida. Yeah, we have high humidity, but typically we have very high heat, and it's not uncommon for pilots to fly and not used to carb heat, and maybe I've lost power because of carburetor ice. We have to think logically in these scenarios to the best of our abilities to try to solve them. And of course, if we can't get it refired, we're gonna, slide down and we're gonna go down the rest of the power loss checklist to attempt to get it started. Now, one thing that they don't list here, and this is once again where common sense might not be so common, so we're gonna state it, that if the prop is no longer turning, also known as windmilling, we're gonna have to use the start position on the magneto, and it says check all, but maybe somebody doesn't think to do that, and we could have had a refire, but we didn't think to put it into the start position and get it fired up. So you're going to want to prioritize your workload. The cockpit's going to be super busy anytime an emergency is taking place, and we have to make sure that we are using our time wisely. But the first thing that I always try to keep in my mind is that I have to fly the aircraft first. It's easy to get that lost in translation as we're trying to look at other things to fix the issue that we find ourselves in. Now, ABC is a great way to always start any sort of emergency or anything that goes amiss is immediately get ourselves on that best glide speed, maximize our time in the air. The more time that we can buy ourselves, the better. And as you see here, time isn't always present for troubleshooting. So that means that if I lose my power at 2,500 feet, I don't have a whole lot of time. I might not make it down the checklist, and at that point, I'm just looking for the best place to land that I can do in a safe manner to not hurt myself, my passengers, or anyone else that I might come across. And of course, even the AFM states clearly that the pilot should concentrate on flying the airplane to extract maximum performance. And in my mind, I decipher that at low altitudes as maximum time in the air. And FAD, the acronym, is a wonderful way to think about it and quickly get yourself back on track if you find yourself getting off track. Number one, fly the airplane, assess the situation, and that's in this situation, I would say, hey, I don't have a ton of time. Maybe I just need to focus on trying to land safely. So my plan, would be to, hey, let's find the best place to land, make my decision, and then last but not least, do it. A good plan is one that's actually carried out, and a bad plan can be a good one, but you never did it, so it's a bad plan. Navigating is the second priority to flying the aircraft, trying to get your direction. Maybe you are close enough to the airfield to be able to ensure a runway, but navigating maybe isn't as important when you're 7 miles away at 2,500 feet and you know your glide ratio because you're a competent pilot that's done his or her due diligence prior to getting into this situation in the first place. But strategically positioning the aircraft with the wind is something we have to keep in mind. We can use our avionics, if applicable, to reference ground speed to figure out if we're in a headwind or a tailwind, and then note the way the plane is flying to assess if we're in a crosswind. And communicating is important, but it is the least of our worries whenever we're trying to address a power loss situation, because every second that we have is another 10 to 20 or 30 feet, 100 feet lost. We have to pay attention because we can't be focused on explaining to other people what's going on. We need to make sure that we're using our time valuable to keep the plane in the air as long as possible to ensure a safe landing. Now, decisions at this point must be in order. We should have made some decisions. Hopefully, we are already in our best attitude or in our best airspeed. But because we are landing, this is a critical phase of flight. Takeoff, landing, emergencies are critical phases of flight. We can't be talking. We can't have the mic cluttered up. We have to be able to have silence to listen. And if we are communicating with ATC or other pilots in the area, that we can hear those communications being sent back and forth. Now, if you have people in the plane with you and it's somebody that isn't freaking out, it's good to get them involved, have them help you take some of the workload off so that we can all work more efficiently and more effectively and ultimately save time, make better decisions. Two heads is typically better than one. Now, at this point, the checklists show engines not start mech up. We are going to have to land. And by this time, we should have already selected our best landing site, the best place to land safely. And remember when we were talking about navigating, we want to make sure that when we are coming into land, that our final positioning is upwind. That way we can have our ground speed as slow as possible. And our final in-flight checklist. Now, we want to take note of if time permits. So that doesn't mean that we might get to all these things, especially at 2,500 feet. At this point, we're probably at less than 1,000. So we want to set the fuel system as turning the fuel system off as a precedence to doing any of the things prior to it. That'll only take a couple seconds. So at this point, we'll go ahead. We'll put in our 7700. We'll hit ident. We'll let them know, hey, yeah, we are declaring an emergency on the 121.5 frequency, or Unicom as other people know it. And if I'm in a controlled airspace, I'm going to reach out to my tower first before I do anything else. And I want to be clear about what my emergency is. You can't fly the radio, so don't get stuck trying to let people know what's going on if you can't. And unlatching the doors is very important because we don't want to get stuck in the aircraft. We can jam things in the door so that it can't lock. We can also protect our body with our flight bags, anything that will brace our impact from the yoke. And our post-in-flight emergency checklist. So once we've touched down, get away from the aircraft. It could blow up. It could catch on fire. We don't know. We don't want to find out the hard way. So kick out the door, smash the window if the door does get relatched. We just want to prevent possible injury from anything else, including fire. Now, we will have to file a report with the National Transportation Safety Board. You got 10 days to do it, as stated in the Code of Federal Regulations. You want to file that, you could end up in big trouble if you don't. And ideally, last but not least, once the accident's happened, you really don't want to touch anything if you don't have to. In some situations, more damage could be incurred if we don't manipulate certain things, but ultimately, we want to try to leave things alone as best as possible. So hopefully under this presentation, you've learned a couple good ways to address an in-flight emergency and can hopefully make better decisions if you happen to encounter one.